木大輔さんにはすき家で使えるお食事券をお送りいたします。さあ次は11月放送のリクエストを募集します。次回のテーマは元気が出る曲特集です。この曲を聴くと元気になる、やる気が出るなどおすすめやエピソードを添えてご応募くださいね。さあ次も4曲選びます。そうなんです、すき家レディオ時間帯によってリクエスト曲も変わっていますので楽しみにしていてください。携帯をお持ちの方は今すぐすき家ホームページからお気軽に投稿してみてください。すき家レディオ、ここまでのお相手は行楽の秋、元気もりもり高森浩二がお届けしました。
facing immediate and dire economic danger. The New Zealand Cabinet used to have instructions that were guidelines that were given to ministers before they were allowed to receive a modelling result. And those instructions would have all of these, observe all these hazards and tell them how to deal with them and how to read a modelling result correctly. I just happened to be looking at the CSIRO website earlier today, Mark, and it said that anyone reading modelling results should be, quote, cautious and suspicious. I agree, but ministers too often are not. I was going to talk about the limits of some of the measures and indicators we use, particularly GDP, but I won't, because of times. So I think, to sum it all up, the problem with the tools we have to assess the costs of climate change and its responses are that where they bring us to all the time, particularly CGE models, is that when we're trying to project costs over time, costs of policy change, we do end up with a curse. And that is, I call it the curse of the parallel lines. You could also call it the can't win slide, because whenever you project business as usual, that is change in GDP over time, you will always see that business as usual line is parallel to, but higher than, the policy intervention line. So that is, somehow the models represent that investment as always coming out lower than the business as usual. And that's how Frank put it before. It's 4 to 6%. It's a year's delay at 2050. However we project it, that's where we come out. It's a function of the limits of the models. It's a problem to policy, and that's why, and in 1 minute, this is what this is all about really, that's why we're in different parts of the world now trying to change that projection and that approach to policy setting. So we're trying to see, we know of course over time the business as usual line turns down because of the damage of climate change, but how do we turn that bottom line up in the results? Is it possible that climate change intervention, policy intervention, will actually accelerate growth, can actually promote growth? And the idea that that can happen is commonly called green growth. As Mike mentioned, I've spent the last 12 months in something called the Global Green Growth Institute that works in over 20 countries around the world, working with governments that believe that can happen and that are committed to it. I don't know what measures or indicators I can use for success there. There aren't any numbers. 23 is too small a number in terms of governments. But in terms of degree of enthusiasm for a policy approach which assumes that it's possible that intervention can promote growth, then I can report strong success at small scale, because governments like those in Ethiopia, Indonesia, Mongolia and the UAE, very diverse circumstances, are increasingly enthusiastic about this approach. The World Bank says that inclusive green growth is the pathway to sustainable development. It is the only way of reconciling all of these conflicts and dilemmas. And there's a new study that's looking at the evidence for this proposition. So it's going beyond the many theoretical supports for the idea that climate change policy can promote growth. It's called the New Climate Economy, the Commission on the New Climate Economy. It's chaired by former President of Mexico, Calderon, and look for its results coming out soon. It will be investigating what GGI and many others at much greater scale have done, and looking at just what are the factors involved in finding the opportunities rather than simply the costs of responding to climate change, evidence-based. It'll look at whether, in other words, that bottom curve in all of those graphs can be made to turn up, so that the cost of intervention is seen as an investment, is properly seen as an investment that returns quickly, and that can provide more confidence to ministers that they can intervene and know that responding to climate change does look more like an opportunity than an obstacle, even if we don't really know what the costs of those interventions are. Thanks, Mike.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to this climate change colloquium organised by the ANU Climate Change Institute on the topic climate change, ethics and policy. And as an important duty at the beginning, we acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and we pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. Moving to the more substantive part of the talk, of our presentation. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Mike Rohrbeck. I'm the Director of the Climate Change Institute. And I'd like to frame today's discussion, which, as you know, has two wonderful speakers, Clive Hamilton and John Dryzek. And the framing for this discussion begins by considering what we could call the areas of discourse, or the collection of dialogues, of multi-logs around climate change, in which we all participate. And we can arrange these roughly in a hierarchy, with climate science right at the bottom, the natural sciences. And you'll recognise that this hierarchy proceeds roughly from natural science at the bottom to the human sciences and human affairs at the top. Climate science is sometimes taken as being settled, and in one sense that's true. We know well enough everything we need to do to know exactly the direction we need to take. In another sense, it is far from true, because we do not understand aspects of the way that the climate system works anything like well enough to know the dangers in which we are heading on any of the paths that we choose to take. We do not understand, for example, how fast Arctic ice is melting. We don't understand how fast methane is being released from Arctic systems. We don't understand how rainfall distributions are changing. We don't understand shifts in circulation patterns, particularly in the oceans. So, and we don't understand how all of this is interacting with the biosphere, both on land and in the oceans. So, in that sense, the science is far from settled. There are many, many critical questions. Next up the tree, we have climate impacts, the ways in which changes in the natural functioning of the Earth system as climate impact on humankind. Largely a question of natural science, and also very much alive as a set of research topics. Then we move into what we do, and I've just put here our two very broadest strategies, adaptation and mitigation, leaving aside a few of the, let's call them outliers. On one side is the outlier of geoengineering, and Clive Hamilton has written extensively about that. On the other side is the current outlier, our preferred policy as a nation, which is to pretend that nothing is happening. That's also a response strategy, of course, and it carries dangers and consequences just as much as any of the other responses that we can take. Next, we have the set of policy and economic instruments that, in a sense, organise and modulate our responses, that help us as a society and as a world to govern and to carry through our responses. And then right at the top, we have the subject of today's discussion, the ethical framings that help us to condition, to make our important choices as to how we orient ourselves in lower parts of this hierarchy, and the phrase I've used, the narratives that help us to understand and tell both ourselves and others what our positions are. This is just one snapshot of the climate science. Here are 4 pathways that emissions can take over the next 2 centuries. The black line on the left is what they've done over the last 2 centuries. The only one that meets a 2-degree warming is the bottom one. The one at the top is between 4 and 5. And